Hello, everyone. My name is Reese Garlinski, and this is Where You Want to Be, Episode 2 on Brussels. So, today I'm going to take you through the brief overview of the history of Brussels, talk about some of the most important sites in their history, give you some travel advice, and give you some of my recommendations for if you ever go to Brussels and some nearby cities. But to open, I always like to do some quick facts, and the first one I'm going to give you is the etymology of the name Brussels. So, it started with the Old Dutch word broek, B-R-O-U-C, which meant marsh, and then stella, which is the Old Dutch word for kind of settlement or home. So pretty much Borstella, the original name of this area, this settlement was settlement in the marsh. This came up right around the 10th century. The 10th century CE is when the first settlement of where Brussels is today came up, and that was Borstella or Brosella. As one, I'm saying Sella, I mean Stella, Brostella. And those two together mean settlement in the marsh. Right around the 10th century CE, it first popped up. Now, once that term is anglicized, we pretty much get Brussels. And that's why we, Americans and Brits and English-speaking part of the world, call this city Brussels, where its origins, pardon my butchering of the pronunciation, it's Bruxella. So that is the start there. Some other quick fun facts for you are actually that here in Brussels is where the comic book started. The speech bubble was actually invented here in Brussels, and for a long time, 80% of the comics ever produced for Europe were produced right inside of Brussels. The most famous is The Adventures of Tintin. It's this short ginger-haired kid that has kind of this older father figure that acts as his kind of sidekick slash veteran grizzly lead, and his little white dog. Together they go on adventures and they explore different things. He's kind of like a spy adventurer. And this comic actually represents and shows many of the different happenings and shifts in political view and perspective within things that are happening in Belgium, and most specifically in Brussels. Another fact for you, and the final one I'll give you before we get into some fun history here, is that the number 7 is really, really important to Brussels and its Belgians. Specifically, the number 7 has this because of the fact that it connects to alchemy, and 7 is really popular in a lot of alchemic properties, and that kind of scratches an itch for the Belgians. They're very into comics and different aspects of the ethereal and mystic stuff. But on top of that, the number 7 is important because Brussels itself, the main part of the city, has 7 major streets. Certain buildings have 7 sides, and a lot of things in Brussels were designed with the number 7 in mind. Why that exactly is has a bunch of speculation. There's some very ghost story explanations, as well as some other very it was just archaeology and that city design made sense. But nonetheless, the number 7 is super important in Brussels, and you're able to see that when looking at different stuff in the city. So I urge you to look into an even further history of that. So I've given you guys some quick facts about Brussels, and now let me give you some major history points. If you want to learn more about the history of this country after I talk about this, I'm going to give you some sources that you can do that on. But for now, let me give you the most major points of Brussels history so you can kind of understand what we're talking about when we get into the cool sites, their history, and the things I recommend to do in this city, which is considered the capital of Europe because of how many of the EU's major things that it has, like the Commission, the High Council, all that. So to start, Brussels was first inhabited by different people in prehistoric times. I won't give you the specifics on them because it is a whole lot to digest. More importantly, where Brussels has access to the Seine River, which it shares with Paris, and has access points to the Rhine River, meaning that not only was this a water source, and where there's water, there is life, it also means that Brussels in its early stages was able to trade with both French cities and German cities, think Cologne, Germany, and Paris, France. In the mid-1400s, Brussels was made a part of the Burgundian territories of Burgundy. And then after that, trade continued to develop. Mainly the sale of cloth and trade of cloth was the big thing that stimulated the Brussels economy and gave this city capital to grow. And as time goes on, there's more and more interactions with foreign powers, both nearby and afar. And because of this, Brussels actually becomes one of the major figures under the Holy Roman Empire. It's kind of the capital of this lowland region, being the main city over even things like Bruges and Antwerp and other major cities in the area. So Brussels becomes the capital right around the 1500s, and after that there's an even bigger shift. So it goes from being small city for trade to big capital city, all the way to being a city where the Reformation took root. Of course, Germany's where the Protestant Reformation really took off because of Martin Luther, but beyond that, one of the first places that it really was able to get some traction and had people start to die for their newfound faith in Protestantism, Lutheranism, all things like that, was Brussels. Brussels actually had many people die at the stake for their faith, and many people continue to push on for the sake of caring about their ideals and all that above all else. So that happens up around the 1500s, and Brussels continues to develop from there. Through a million royal differences, marriages, wars that happened, and I'm not going to get into, Brussels and this greater area of what we know as Belgium, which was the Lower Netherlands, was a part of Spain under the Holy Roman Empire. Now, when the 80 Years' War occurs in the late 1500s to the early mid-1600s, the Greater Netherlands, being the one we know as Netherlands today, Amsterdam and all that, and Brussels actually move towards independence. They get independence both from Spain and each other. But with that, Brussels fell under the rule of the former dynasties that it was ruled by, because they wanted to have separate representation from the Netherlands, Amsterdam and all that we know today, because they had different faith, different beliefs, different ongoings, very different culture with the way the languages that are spoken, very Dutch versus like French Dutch and mixed and all sorts of things that make Belgians. So with that, they want to separate and kind of stay with what they were. They weren't as discontent with life under the Spaniards and all that as the Netherlands were. So they kind of end up in this weird half-free, half-owned policy. But with that, in the late 1600s, France appears under Louis XIV and tries to take over Brussels using bombardment, siege tactics, all that. It doesn't fully work because later on, in 1713, the Habsburgs come through royal marriage and some wars. They get power of the region and get control of Brussels. And now what occurs is perhaps the most important point in the history of Brussels so far, and maybe ever. It is the Brabant Revolution. This is an uprising that pushes Austrian rulers out of Brussels and allows this nation to self-represent and self-qualify itself as a new nation represented by its nationalists and not foreign powers, and it moves to get back with its old partner. This is right around the same time as the French Revolution, I think 1789, where Brussels pushes the Austrians out with the Brabant Revolution. Then, 25 years later, after Napoleon has his whole shebang and gets defeated at Waterloo, the Congress of Vienna of 1815 is a place where the map of Europe was redrawn to make up for everything Napoleon did. And it's here that Brussels actually decides to work with The Hague and actually ends up reunifying itself as the United Kingdom of the Netherlands with Holland. And because of that, there's a dual capital between Brussels and The Hague. And with that, we get to the point where they are a united nation for a short period. However, this newfound union only lasted 15 years, as the same differences that divided these two nations before reared their head again. Different linguistics, different culture, different preference of religion. It just made it so that these two nations, Holland and Brussels, Belgium, just couldn't get along. So Brussels is, of course, the head of this, the capital for Belgium, signs up for independence and becomes the nation we know today as Belgium, right around 1830. Then we get to the 1900s, where things get very rough. Both in World War I and World War II, Belgium was occupied by German forces. First time German, second time members of the Yahtzee party, like the spelling game. And both times there's a heavy resistance. Huge resistant forces are born, bred, and raised in Brussels to resist against this German invading force, whether it be the first time or the second time. After the war, a lot of things change. Brussels develops as one of the six, at least the capital of the six being Belgium. So the six were the six major nations that were most affected by the things that led to the formation of the European Union, starting as the European Coal and Steel Community Organization. And anything that affected, Europe, it was first tested in these six nations. These six nations being the lowland nations of Luxembourg, Netherlands, and Belgium, with Brussels at the head of that, and then Italy, France, and Germany, West Germany, that is. All these nations were the first ones where American and European politicians were speculating and figuring out what to do, and this was where the testing grounds for everything was. Anything that happened to Europe later happened first in these six nations, one of them being Belgium, with its centerpiece in Brussels. So Brussels in the 60s starts to develop as kind of the heart of Europe. It's the capital of a bunch of different organizations under what becomes the European Union. Think the Treasury, the Commission, all sorts of things like that. Major meeting places are still today located in Brussels, and that starts back in the 60s. And then we get to 1989, when Brussels actually becomes one of the recognized autonomous three regions of Belgium. There's the Brussels capital region, and then there's Wallonia, which is the southern part, which is more French-speaking, and then there's a northern part, Flanders, which is the Dutch-speaking part. And It's a huge thing with the culture. It's literally like night and day when you go from one to one. When I was passing through this region, like you literally hear Dutch, Dutch, Dutch as you come down from Amsterdam, and you pass through the part of Belgium that is Flanders, and you're like, oh, this is fine. This is Dutch. And then bang, instantly French. And it's just out of nowhere, and Brussels is very, very French speaking. But there's also Dutch parts too. There's Dutch bakeries, there's Dutch cheese places, and then there's the same thing on the other side, just a bunch of French. So it's very, very unique to this area, and that happens in 1989. And that pretty much gets us to the present, where Brussels is considered one of the major capitals of Europe. Is the capital, at least of the European Union, in the sense that it has so many of the headquarters there in Brussels, because of the fact that it has a huge connection to the history of the major wars, the wars that brought Europe together after much division, all of that. And Brussels is a very well-funded capital. It has a bunch of art schools. There's so many things to talk about with Brussels, but that's all I'm going to give you on the history part for now. Now, if you are more interested in learning a deeper part of Brussels history, think architecture, why wars happened, how things really developed, I did cover that too. This is just a taste of the history to kind of set us up with a frame of what we're going to look at next about Brussels. But if you want to look at more, I did cover that. And I covered that on the Young History Podcast, which is the podcast that started all this love for history for me. And I covered both the history of Brussels on its own and the greater history of Belgium as a nation. So I encourage you to check both of those out. Those will be in the description down below. And now we're going to talk about some historical sites and their history. One of the most important is Little Mannequin Piss. This little statue has stood since 1619. This statue depicts a small boy urinating, and the story has as many questions as it does answers. The statue may be there to commemorate a period where little boys were encouraged to pee on pieces of leather in the streets as part of the culture. And the streets near Mannequin Piss today are used for their history of being a leathery area. There are many leatheries in the streets near the Mannequin Piss. This is the leading theory with the most evidence, but another story says that the little boy was a spy for Brussels that foiled a foreign enemy's plan by peeing on explosives set to kill someone. Of course, another very significant thing about the history here is Belgian chocolate. Belgian chocolate is supposed to be the best in the world, and that started with an 1884 law that required the chocolate to have a minimum 35% cocoa content. The Belgian praline is the classic Belgian chocolate. There are some pictures of them here. The chocolate shell has many different fillings within it. Brussels was where the chocolate box was invented. It replaced the chocolate holding cone, and the cornet durée is a type of chocolate that pays homage to the old holding cone. The greater Belgian chocolate history starts when the Spaniards brought back cocoa from the New World and Africa. It was traded in Belgium, which was part of the Spanish Empire for centuries. Most chocolatiers were pharmacists that thought there was a medical purpose of cocoa. These same pharmacists experimented with cocoa flavors and ended up as full-time confectioners and chocolatiers. Old Town and the Grand Palace. The area near the Grand Palace was originally a market square for common people. The Museum of the City of Brussels in Dutch is called the Bread House for its old use as a place for bakers to sell their goods. Just like in Amsterdam, they are thin houses here. The ones in Old Town are thin because the wider a house faced more tax, so wider houses were taxed more. So wide buildings from the past were made by the rich who could afford the high taxes, and the thin, narrow ones were for the common man who wanted to avoid as many taxes as possible. The Belgian Royal Palace that sits in the center of Old Town Square and is at the heart of many tourist destinations has been around since about the 1820s and took all the way until 1934 to finish completion. It's a super significant part of the history of Belgium and is one of the most visited spots in the city. The final historical site we have is Cinque Terre Park. The park is mostly surrounded by a U-shaped monument that looks similar to the Brandenburg Gate. It was commissioned by the worst Belgian of all time, Leopold II, but it was built to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Belgium's independence. The next thing I want to do is look into some tips I can have for you guys about Brussels. On the way into Brussels, I hopped off the train station in Antwerp, which I recommend you do as well. The Antwerp train station is a marvel within itself, but you'd stay in and have a waffle at Chez Albert. Pictured here is that waffle, and so is the train station. I had this waffle with darkened milk chocolate, which was my favorite waffle in Belgium. And speaking of, I also went to Liège on my way out of Brussels and had waffles without anything on it, which is the Liège style of Belgium, and they were also flawless. Much, much denser waffle that one is. And then also with this train station, right next to it is one of the biggest Chinatowns in Europe. and you definitely should visit that as well. I've got some photos of that here, and it's super, super cool. If you are a fan of any of the fine arts in Brussels, there are many places to see it. One of the best is the Royal Galleries, which were made for the first king and queen of Belgium. It is built in the Florentine style with pillars and also has a Gladstone roof, which was rare in Belgium because of the constant rain. And of course, you have to go see Mannequin Piss, the Grand Palace, and I do recommend you go see those at night because once you're done with all those museums, which I think you should do, go check out the museums in Brussels, so many different ones to look at with art and all that. But at nighttime, I think, is when you should go see the Grand Palace and Mannequin Piss. I think Brussels really comes alive at this time of night, and the colors and lights just look awesome. I liked using the daytime to go see EU buildings and the Cinque Terre Park because so many different things were open as that afternoon time was setting in and the afternoon was coming in. One of those was the Theatre Royal du Parc, which is a thing I walked up into when I was walking towards Cinque Terre Park. There was a French concert of local artists going on, and I had this delicious meat plate and this meat and cheese plate for dirt cheap, so I thought it was great. And then, of course, here is my final suggestion. You're in Belgium, so you must get the thing that is maybe most important to real Belgians daily, which is their pommes frites or fries. For me, the best way to get the fries is by going to a local spot that does traditional and experimental things. I say go to Patatak. It's a local fries place that serves homemade frites in a cone with the classic mayo and other cool sauces like this one I had here. I also had some homemade mustard seed chicken nuggets that were unique too. And now that I've talked about some brief history and also talked about not only the history of different sites here in the city of Brussels, as well as all the things I did and suggest you guys go do when you're in Brussels, we get to come to an end. So this is the end of the video. I'm very thankful you guys watched, and I very much hope you enjoyed, but there's more where that came from on Belgium and its capital city, Brussels. So I also covered some things about Antwerp and Liège, waffles, stuff like that. I talked about the greater history of Brussels in a podcast that's also going to be down below in the description. It's a longer form video about the length of this video. Instead of it being layered in with landmark history and things like that, it's purely the history of the development and growth of the city of Brussels. So that's going to be down below. It's on the Young History podcast. Along with that, a year ago, I also covered the history of Belgium itself, Belgium as the whole country that Brussels is within. So I covered the split between the Dutch-French cultures, the influence from the Netherlands, the influence from Spain, the interactions with Germany, and everything in between. So I talked about that in a very long form in my episode of Young History on Belgium. And then if you want to know this about Brussels, I covered Brussels as well. So if this fixed your fancy, kind of scratched that learning itch, and you want to get more, all that's going to be down below in the description of other stuff I've created about Belgium and Brussels. But more importantly, I just want to say thank you guys so much for being here. I appreciate you watching. I appreciate you wanting to learn. And I'm very glad you guys get to come with me as I take you with me around the world and help you find the place within it, which is where you want to be. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you have a good one.